Welcome to Season 2 of Lead Speak, where we continue to empower the current and the next generation of SLP leaders in public education. Whether you're an aspiring leader, a seasoned pro, or somewhere in between, this season is packed with insight tailored just for you. I'm your co-host, Natalie Lebrun.
And I'm Judy Rich. Welcome to Season 2 of Lead Speak, school-based SLP podcast.
Hey Judy, good morning. How are you doing?
I am great and so looking forward to this morning's podcast.
Absolutely. Why don't you introduce our special guest for today?
I am so happy to do this and honored. Phuong Palafox is a Vietnamese Chinese multilingual speech-language therapist, author, and advocate. She has been within and alongside school districts for the last 2 decades, working as both an elementary and secondary school-based SLP, elementary lead SLP, regional service center education specialist for SLP and autism, consultant, professional development specialist, clinical service provider, and mentor for professionals and students. Currently, her time is spent empowering clients and their families in her clinic. She also provides keynotes and workshops for school districts and organizations globally. With a foundation of evidence-based, human-centered practices, she invests in culturally responsive and sustaining practices, narrative-based interventions, and advocacy for educators and service providers. She is the author of The Heartbeat of Speech-Language Pathology, an excellent read, just gotta say, and Buoy, a children's book about her family's refugee journey. Attendees leave her presentations and storytelling feeling validated, refueled, and re-engaged in their already impactful, meaningful work. Welcome to Lead Speak, Phuong.
Hi, thank you for the beautiful introduction.
You are welcome. It was my pleasure. Let's jump right in. Tell us about your journey and how you became a speech-language pathologist.
You know, I think once you're 2 decades in, this is the question that you think about a lot sometimes. And I think, growing up as the eldest daughter of refugees, communication was always a big part of our narrative. And at the age of 6, I was the family interpreter for Ma, and then did all the paperwork for my siblings and going to school. Growing up in middle school and on, one of my closest friends is a person who stutters. And so I got to see firsthand the impact and the advocacy that our field does. So now, thinking about my work, I think both of those identities really formed why I became a speech language pathologist. It was to move alongside people and empowering their communication. And then it's all of my lived experiences.
You know, you started out in Minnesota, right?
Wisconsin, you were in the right area with the Midwest.
Oh man, my geography failed me. Wisconsin. And then you ended up in Texas. Tell us a little bit about that.
So my parents, after they were on their boat refugee journey, they ended up in Hong Kong, where they were taking in refugees, and they were there for a year. And then I think there was a battle between my parents, between Australia and the United States, and the U.S. won out. And at the time, yay, in the Midwest, there were many people who were sponsoring Vietnamese families. And so Vietnam veteran by the name of William Farrow sponsored our family. And so we went to Whitewater, Wisconsin, and that's where my family started. Ended up coming down to Texas. So I grew up in the Lone Star State. But then for graduate school, on a whim, I decided to apply for their graduate program. It was the #1 program at the time. And I think out of ego, I just wanted to see if I could get in. So it was special that I ended up getting my master's degree there.
That's awesome. It might be like an oldest daughter syndrome of trying to prove a point sometimes because you're the leader of the clan.
So yeah, whether you want to be or not.
Correct. Very much. I might be speaking from personal experience here.
I could sense that. I could sense that, Natalie.
So tell us about your transition from going from being a leader in your therapy space and working with your students into stepping into more of a leadership role outside of your therapy space and starting to speak to other professionals and other school districts across the state and nationwide and really across the world?
This question tickles me because sometimes I'm like, I don't know how it happened. So I love therapy. I love my students. I love kids. Like to be able to grow their light is my jam. And they're silly and they're funny. So I always just did my work and did my own thing. I like to do a lot of creative things. I like to pull in a lot of people to highlight our students. And I was in the Round Rock Independent School District for a couple of years. And then someone approached and said, "Hey, do you want to be lead?" And I said, "Nope, not my thing. That's too much responsibility." And then she asked again. And I said, "All right, I will talk to some people about it, get back to you." And then the third time she brought it up, I said, "All right, I've made my decision. I will do it as long as I can still keep a small caseload," which I did that for a few years. And then our regional service center in the state of Texas, we have 20 of them that oversee like 60 plus ish school districts. They reached out and said, "Hey, do you want this position?" I declined 3 times. And then on the third time, I was like, "Okay, world, cool." So I was able to support, I think at the time we had maybe 65 school districts with charter schools. And while I was there, the person, my predecessor, was Kathy Clapsaddle, who is so smart and so brilliant. And I worked my rear off to try to do everything in the same way that she did. And I remembered somebody was like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "What?" It was because I was crying at work. And I was like, "I'm trying to plan this thing for all these special education directors." And I don't know how Kathy and Jim Gonzalez was like, "Stop. You don't need to be Kathy. Kathy's great. We love her. Awesome. I'm friends with her. But I need for you to do you." And so for whatever reason, and people don't talk to me like that, like straight talk, like, "Here's what you need to do, Phuong." And I took it to heart. And from that moment in 2012, so over 10 years ago, I leaned into just being me and whatever that looks like, crying every day, feeling the feelings, doing things in silly, bold ways. And it served me well in my speech language therapy and also in leadership. And so while at Region 13, you plan for professional development, but I was able to center the needs of our multilingual communicators because I am one. I was able to center under-resourced and underfunded communities because that's how I grew up. And then just bringing a lot of fun back to it. Worked at a bilingual clinic for about 6-ish years. And while I was there, served in the clinic, but then also served in the schools, and then also provided professional development across the country. And so now, with my own business since 2020, I have my own clinic, but a majority of my work is getting to advocate for our profession and for educators. And I feel really grateful to have the privilege of getting to choose what I want to do right now.
That's so cool. It really, like, the visual that came to my head while you were speaking was a braid, like a braid with multiple strings, and how they all have like interwoven together, right, to where you are today. So just bring that really kind of diverse background, not only your personal background, but your professional background into, leading a regional center and also doing therapy work and building your own business, like bringing all these braids together or these strings together to build this braid. That's so great because it's not a linear path.
It's not a linear path. And I'm not one of those people where people are like, "Well, I want to do what you do, Fong. So what was your plan?" And I had no plan. My plan was I always stayed true to myself. And then when you have to make a decision, you know that there are no wrong decisions. But that's when I get quiet. In whatever quiet looks like for you, Natalie, for you, Judy, for me, Fong. And when you get quiet, I feel like when you listen to yourself and whatever source it is that you need in your life, that's when you're like, "All right, here's what I'm going to do next." And it's always served me well.
So, Fong, you're a sought after keynote speaker, and I happen to be in the audience, almost in the front row. For,
You're in the picture, Judy.
for the first time, you were a keynote speaker at the Texas Speech Language Hearing Association. Since you are a renowned keynote speaker as well as a compelling storyteller. Tell us the story of your first keynote speech because it's amazing.
Oh, also another, it's a joyful story. So in 2014, I did 3 sessions at Tisha, and it was my first Tisha that I attended because Region 13 said, you must submit something and then present. And I said, okay. And then I submitted something else. And then I submitted something else. And so based on the feedback of that, the following year, Tisha reached back out and said, we would love for you to be the keynote speaker. And I remembered I was in a TJ Maxx parking lot. And I'm like, what, Robin? What do you want me to do? Are you sure? Because the year before it was Brene Brown, and you've had Patch Adams and Temple Grandin. And so I worked on this keynote for over 6 months. And I consulted with people, I mean, everything. And so, I told you, Natalie, earlier, you go big and then you go home. That's my motto. Is that I wanted to do the keynote. I wanted to recognize the stories of my family and the families that I've had a chance to support along the way. And I decided that we were going to break a Guinness Book of World Record. And because I love music of the hip hop persuasion, I was like, I looked through the Guinness Book of World Records and I was like, we're going to break a record for the most people rapping publicly at the same time for a audio recording that is going to be sold. That was what it was for. Anyways, we ended up donating all of the funds to a great cause. We did not get the record because I think that year there were 5 or 6,000 attendees in the audience. It was a larger year. This was pre-COVID. But that's okay because we had so much fun and we did a story grammar literacy based rap with all the speech language pathologists and audiologists in Texas. But the best part was that I was 7 months pregnant when I stepped on that stage. And when I turned around, people gasped because they were like, should you be on this stage? And I was like, I got this. I've had babies before. We're all good. So we did the keynote. We got done with it. And then my water broke early in the hotel room the following day. And I had a meeting with SLPs the following day at Tisha. And I said, sorry, got to go drive back to Austin because we were in San Antonio at the time. So luckily we got home and that baby was in the NICU for a few weeks. And his name is Story. And so, just like my mom stepped on a wooden boat to cross the South China Sea when she was, 7, 8 months pregnant, mine was different, but I got to step on the Tisha stage with a baby in my tummy. And then, so he's my Tisha baby. He turns 10 this school year.
That's amazing. I mean, if I think about that story and how really that moment in time has almost become like your calling card for a lot of people. That's how they know you, right? Is through this rap. And like with the intersection of getting that feedback of like, Phuong, just be yourself. I mean, what great evidence and what great example of like when you take the chance and you're brave enough to show up as yourself, what amazing opportunities can come from that.
Honestly, Natalie, you're so right. I mean, I got to talk to a NISLA group earlier this week, and that was one of the things that I shared. I'm like, be you. Like the relationships that we have with people, it is not just about the students. It's not all them. It's a relationship. It's them and it's you. But if you've forgotten yourself in this whole complementary space, then you're only getting half of the joy and half of the love and half of the intelligence. So bring yourself back into the narrative. And I do think that's when transformation happens, when you share yourself in that experience as well.
I think that's what makes the difference between an SLP being a real human being
Yes.
versus speech language pathology services being delivered by a robot.
Yeah.
Or by a software system.
Yes.
Right. So
Yep.
anyway, I digress. One of the things that you talk a lot about, Phuong, and you seem to be very passionate about is making sure that we're taking care of each other as speech language pathologists. And this is especially true when you have the crown on your head and you're sitting on the throne of being the coordinator or the lead, right? You're charged with taking care of your people, of your team, so that they in return can take care of the students and they can take care of their fellow staff members. Can you talk to us a little bit about how leaders can create a safe space for SLPs when they're coming to you expressing concerns or challenges without leaning into the using judgment to show up for them?
That's a beautiful question, and it's a thoughtful, intentional question. I think the first thing to acknowledge, based in my experience, is that when SLPs are bestowed the opportunity to become lead, to become coordinator, it's usually because of your humanity. It's usually because you had those great relationships with your students, with your faculty, with your staff, with your families. And then we get catapulted into these leadership roles. So then you're like, wait a second. And no one's really taught us, because this podcast did not exist over 10 years ago, how to do it. And then all these things are thrown at us. Like, here's compliance with regard to the law, federally and statewide. Here is the funding. Here's a budget, Phuong. And I'm like, what? Like, when was the last time I, did my like, what do you want me to do with this? And so it gets overwhelming. But I think the first thing is to recognize you got this job because of who you are as a whole human. So you have permission to lean back into that. The other part, you asked the question about how do we support and how do we guide the people that get to support, right? I always go back to that. This is the job that we get to do. And I think it's valuing your speech language pathologists as people. And we have to keep saying that their value is not based on their productivity and it's not based on their compliance. It's based on the fact that they chose this profession and they're showing up every day as a whole, complete person who may be parents, who may be taking care of their own family members, who may be members of a community. And so putting that first, and I'll tell you right now, the second thing to acknowledge is that our work has exceeded our capabilities at times, and to recognize the current status quo of our systems. And I can tell you, for me, from being a speech language pathologist on a couple of campuses and then moving into a leadership role around 2011, 2012, at the time our district used a workload model. We didn't give a certain number of students per SLP. We looked at the needs of each of the students. The SLPs, we had a tracking system with points allotted for needs. There were more needs if they needed AAC or AT. There were more needs if they were multilingual. So there were certain parameters and factors, but the workload in those couple of years when I was district lead, it increased. And so recognizing, you know what? For example, in the state of Texas that year, like for the past 10 years, we got like 1 million people into our state. And so knowing that with increased workload, we are all doing the best that we can. So from a mathematical, quantitative perspective, it is more work. And especially for states that do not have caseload caps, and not to say that those states are easier, I won't go down that path today, but to recognize that, you know what, we're doing the best, but I'm going to help you when you need help, because maybe Phuong as lead, my plate is bigger right now and Judy's plate is smaller and she needs help. So I'm going to go help her. And being really transparent about that process, like who needs help, who doesn't need help. And I also think as a leader, we get to model what asking for help looks like. Because if everyone looks like they're getting their stuff done and everyone looks like they're compliant, and I'm going to be really honest in this podcast, is that there is non-compliancy that is happening. It is not an SLP problem. It is not a coordinator or lead problem. It is just the mere fact that there is so much work. And so Recognizing all of those things, modeling, hey, special education director, we need help. But I'm going to express it to my SLPs to show that I'm asking for help. I'm going to show what it looks like to not look at my computer screen during my lunchtime, and I'm going to eat my lunch. Or I'm going to model what it looks like to just take a walk outside in between my sessions, because it's a lot to go back to back to back to back to back. And so, I think that goes for the leads, but there's also a lot of leadership, I think, within a district that they're not official titles, and those people know who they are. And so they're usually the ones also modeling some of those behaviors that we need to keep in mind.
Phuong, I have observed and been a student of leadership for years. And one of the things that I've had the opportunity to do is mentor new SLP leaders in their jobs, in their school district jobs. And it's it it's there's tension there when you're new to your job, because you're getting pressure to be accountable for the compliance, for the timelines, for the service match, for the budget, for covering for vacancies with existing resources. All of that is what your bosses are holding you accountable for. And so the risk is that you lose yourself in that as a young leader. And so I'm very, very happy about your reminder to be true to yourself, you do you, and also that the accountability, the true accountability for leadership, is not about timelines or compliance or budget. The true accountability is to your team and to safeguarding the members of your
Yes.
team, right?
Yes. No, you're so right. I love that you said that. I remembered whenever I became lead, we were lucky. We were in a district that had 3 leads. And so I was not hanging out there by myself. And Tammy Qualls, who I just had lunch with a couple of weeks ago, and who I'll see this upcoming Saturday, she modeled what it looked like to protect our group of speech language pathologists and to be loyal to them. And I remembered at the time when you feel, and just because you do things well doesn't mean the burden isn't so very heavy. So I think about, district leads. And then I remembered people would say, hey, Phuong, hey, Tammy, hey, Hannah, we need to come talk to your group about this. There was non-compliancy here. And she was like, no, this is my group. We're going to use our meetings to fuel our speech language pathologists. But she protected us. And I got to see her do that and what that looked like. It doesn't mean we were not going to address the compliancy. Absolutely, we were. But I think that loyalty can be felt. And, right now I talk about workload. I mean, across the nation, right? Getting to spend time with so many districts. The workload has increased everywhere. But in the districts where they are keeping their speech language pathologists, and in keeping them, it makes a huge difference for your students and your families and your campuses. Their SLP leads who are just taking care of, with love and compassion, their group of people. And then everything else we will take care of in due time.
So let's talk about overwhelm, because you've been
Yeah.
studying that. You have opinions about that. You have data about that. That's important. And it's a huge topic, because outside of our span of control is that increased amount of work that students and families bring to us. And also outside of that, our span of control are all of the compliance pieces that consume way too many resources. Meeting compliance takes up 75% of our availability, and then our services, our SLP services, maybe get 25% or 20%. And we need to somehow invert that. So let's talk about what you're learning about overwhelm. And also, as you talk about what you're studying and what you're thinking about overwhelm, could you also weave in there a couple of things that SLP leaders can do to create that supportive environment that we've just been talking about?
So a couple of years ago, I connected with Dr. Tobias Kroll out of Texas Tech University, and it was whenever I had published Heartbeat of Speech Language Pathology. So we stayed in touch, and this is not Overwhelm school-based SLPs is not necessarily something that he was thinking and feeling about, but he does do qualitative research, and so in 2020, we started talking about how we could gather more data, more research about overwhelmed school-based SLPs. And so we collaborated. And then we also brought in McKenna Morgan, who was a student at the time. And now this is her clinical fellowship internship year, looking at overwhelmed school-based SLPs. And so what we ended up doing is that we wanted to get qualitative research to see how school-based SLPs could advocate, or if they knew how to advocate. That's what we thought about going in. So we were able to gather 2 focus groups, one at the elementary level and then one at the secondary level, middle and high school, because we know those needs are also vastly different in supporting students. And after we had the focus groups, we did a line by, it was thousands and thousands of data points, and it took about a year to group those all together. And what we found out in this research is that overwhelmed school-based speech language pathologists are in fact advocating. So we went in thinking they didn't know how to advocate, and we found out they are not only advocating, but advocating repeatedly, but the response to the advocacy was not what they needed. And then we, after grouping all of the data analysis points, there were 3 areas that were contributing to the overwhelm. One is that how SLPs are organized in the schools. Typically, our leadership in special education, they're usually not speech language pathologists. And so if you don't know the roles and responsibilities, then it does make it more challenging to know what your team needs. And then the second arena is that it had to do with our roles and responsibilities, in that people overall don't know what we do. And so when people from campus leadership to district leadership to teachers to families, if they don't know what we do, we have to always constantly negotiate the work that we do. So it's not even getting to the therapy. It's not even just doing the assessment, but it's negotiating what a school-based services looks like. So people are asking for things that's not within our repertoire of our eligibility criteria. And then the last part that we noticed in the emerging themes is that there appears to be an SLP culture for overwhelmed school-based SLPs. And within that culture, there are tenets of martyrdom, which, if you define what a martyr does, it's you're sacrificing yourself to do something that is good or allegedly good for the greater whole. And because of that, there were lots of feelings of resentment within our data from our SLPs. And then there was this whole sentiment of perfectionism, which I think aligns really solidly. It's really strongly tethered to compliance, to be honest. Like, this is what I have to do, and this is the only way to do it. And so those are the contributing factors of SLP overwhelm. And then in terms of strategies to support SLPs, that also emerged from the research. One is for SLPs to not just advocate as a singular lone wolf, but to do it collectively, to come together collectively. And there are districts across the country that are beginning to do that, to say, hey, there are some themes right now. And on top of that, when they did advocate collectively, sometimes they did not get what they needed, but the power of the togetherness and the community brought them solace and healing. And I think that's huge. The second thing is, we need to give more support to our SLP leaders, which is why I'm so grateful for this podcast, because I think along the way, we forgot about the people who are doing the support and the empowerment and the leadership for our SLPs. Because if we were thrown into these roles and we don't know what to do in these roles, then we don't have a plan or a path in how to do that. And then the last piece of takeaway from this research that we did is that SLPs have to create boundaries for themselves, and that changing systems is the long game. I mean, it is the long game. And there are so many, I have a course where I talk about all of the pillars that contribute to systemic change. And that has to do with representation. It has to do with research. It has to do with people feeling safe enough to even share what their concerns are. So while all of that is taking place systemically, we have to take care. We are in control of our day to day. So Phuong and Natalie and Judy, I go do my work, but I also get to set boundaries for my home life. And I get to say, I'm the only one, Phuong is the only one that could say, I'm going to put on my calendar, you get to work out today, because I know that it makes me feel good every single day. Which I think addresses that martyrdom issue. Because you can say, I'm such a giver, I'm sacrificing, I'm sacrificing, I'm sacrificing. But if you hear that little quiet voice that's even a little bit resentful, then you need to check yourself, and only you are responsible for changing your day to day. And, I share often that, if something happens once, you let it go. If something happens again and again and again, and you're upset about something often, then you're a part of the common denominator. So I give SLPs permission to prioritize their needs as whole people, and then to be a speech language pathologist or SLP lead or coordinator second.
So I feel like I need to confess something. And Phuong, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, right? When it comes to martyrdom. So when I was serving in that leadership role, and we were, often talking about compliance and documentation and making sure all your T's were crossed and your I's were dotted, right? It was really easy for me to give out praise and affirmation and recognition to those SLPs who were doing those things, right? Because for me to pull data on that is very easy when there's 50 plus campuses to oversee, 70 plus SLP and assistants to oversee, right? So that was something that was very manageable for me, and I could feel I could be very accurate with that because that was data that was pullable, for lack of better words, right? But yet I have to acknowledge the fact that some of that compliance came from martyrdom, where people were working well beyond their contracted hours, right? They were prioritizing compliance and documentation over therapy, which, again, confessing here, I feel like I'm at the confessional. Maybe my guidance as leadership was prioritize documentation. That's what the state will see, right? And worry about therapy tomorrow, right? So, what do leaders do to help recognize good work, right? And to bring motivation and empowerment, but also not feed the monster that is martyrdom and perfectionism?
Mm-hmm. I think the word compliance, when we think about, that's what we are, that's the data that is so public, right? And I think the first thing to recognize is to know your team and to build a safe space to where they can express to you when you need the help. And I think when you have a group of 70 SLPs and SLP assistants, and they trust you enough to say, hey, Natalie, I need help. That's when we get to do the redistribution, right? Or we could say, hey, I have someone here who has a little bit more bandwidth here, and then we're going to do some of that shuffling. So that then fuels and feeds the compliance, which is important. I get that part of it. I think, what do we do to not just feed the martyrdom? I think that's where it goes back to what I was talking about before, where we recognize the humanity. I love districts that every single week there is a system in place where they recognize the joys, and people get to share their positive and their kudos. And some people will roll their eyes at this. I'm a big, like, I will do positive. I'm like you. I will do positive affirmations for you. You've got this. I'm in your corner, Natalie and Judy. I'm cheering you on. But to do it publicly. And I think, in the same way that we set up systems for compliance, we need to set up systems to acknowledge all of our speech language pathologists. So that would be one way. I also love how some SLP leads and coordinators have kind of found the Venn for those two areas, compliance and also humanity and community. So, for example, Jennifer Phillips comes to mind. She is the lead for Pflugerville ISD. And I remember it. I love getting to know bright spots, and then I was like, cool, I can take that and share it out. But like when at the end of the grading period, when SLPs had to do progress reports, and I'm going to be really honest, there's not a lot of SLPs out there that are like, I'm so excited to do progress reports, which we should be though, like to be able to share their progress. I know, right? But she was like, I'm going to like find a space during that time. Y'all just come and you're going to do your progress notes together. But it was also community because she was there. And if you had a question or you had to talk to her about something, you could come up and engage. Or maybe Phuong and Judy needed to talk about something. But it was pairing a task that may not be the most joyous with something that had to do with community and connection. It's all the C's. Compliance compared with community and connection. I think I just created something there. So
I love it.
well, we can talk
a
about
sticker, a t-shirt, or the title of your next
right?
presentation.
There you go. I do also love alliteration. If you notice all of my titles, there's usually some like alliteration there. So I think those are, honestly, I think just this podcast and talking about it, we can't change something until we name it. And if we name martyrdom, that's huge in itself. You're like, oh, that's what I'm doing right now. And for Phuong, who I would say 2018 and 2019 were so hard for me, where I didn't show up to work. I was crying every day, but nonstop. I was really resentful of the human that I married, that I love, of my children, of my work that I did. So I've done a lot of work since that time. It was realizing that I was injecting myself into situations that other people could potentially support. So when we talk about martyrdom, Natalie, I mean, I felt like I was the golden child for that. I am so capable and I am so helpful, and I'm going to, help you SLP and help you SLP. And I'm going to walk through a park and realize that that mom is not in that picture. So I'm going to say, children, my own children, y'all stand there while mama goes and helps someone else. But I had to recognize that it was not my need to I use the word inject. So now I'm like, you know what? Phuong's not going to respond to that social media post. Phuong is not going to do these things. And in doing that, I took back control of what I am doing. I'm doing the things within my jurisdiction well, and I'm giving other people the opportunity to share their strengths and their interests and their progress. And that's been a lifesaver.
I love it. That's a huge thing to recognize and also do, right? Changing that behavior. Yikes. It's hard.
Yeah, go therapy.
Phuong, in season 1, actually our first ever guest on Lead Speak was Charlotte Green. And she talked about leaders creating a brave space, which emanates from the safe space that you were talking about. You can't get to the brave space where your team members will tell you what's really going on, will tell you when they're about ready for you to talk them away from the cliff, when they will tell you what they need, regardless of how much you've been modeling, asking for help, until they have the safe space to do that with you. So all of that relational work and all of that joining tasks with relationship, I think is huge for not only feeling safe at work, but being brave at work. And then the being brave helps you then gather people for a louder voice relative to the type of advocacy that you need to change your conditions,
Yes.
I think.
No, that was very thoughtfully said. I Something came to mind as you were talking about that, Judy, with the safe space that I do want to note is that district leads and coordinators also need to recognize that sometimes their attendance may not necessarily create that safe space. So I always think about the next level, it's a circle of leadership within that district. Because I will tell you, whenever I do a course on culturally responsive assessments, I do a focus group before I go out to the district to get their needs. I always ask to also communicate with their multilingual SLPs. And so, and I ask the leadership, I'm like, is it okay if I just meet with them on my own? And then I'll share the information back to you. But leaders also recognize whenever they're going to step out to then potentially create a safer environment. And then there's someone within that space that may communicate those needs later. And so I think that brave space comes from that safe space, and that safe space could be alongside you lead or without your physical presence. And so it's knowing that, you know what? I can step aside and I'm going to trust my team to do what needs to be done. And I've seen some beautiful district leadership members do that.
What a great way to build capacity and to build future leaders, right? It's
Yes.
almost like finding the aunties and the uncles in your team.
Oh, I
Right?
love
Like,
the
I
idea of
know when I was
aunties
growing
and
up, I
uncles.
had an aunt who has since then passed away, but she was my cool aunt, right? Who wanted to take me shopping to cool stores, not the boring stores that my parents would be taking me to, right? And because of that, I was able to share with her more. I felt safe and brave in the spaces with her because we had that kind
Yeah.
of relationship. And then she, I would assume, would be able to go back to my parents and share if there was something of concern or some themes or whatever. So it's finding those people within your team that can act as, that kind of that middle step between the leadership and the team.
No, I do. I love it. And they're leaders who the building capacity part, building capacity for compliance and roles and responsibilities, building capacity for you as a human being in that leadership role, and then building capacity for all your speech language pathologists on their own campuses. And I always think it goes back to the power of the collective, but y'all gotta let go of that control. There's a phrase in Vietnamese and it's called kia buông. And kia means to piece something apart, and buông means like sadness or ache. And so when someone is going through something, like Judy, if you were going through something, I would say to you, xin kia buông, like please, will you piece apart some of that ache so I can take it on? But to me, that's like agency when it comes to the power of the togetherness. And I love that phrase.
I love it. That's so great. I do want to get to storytelling because I'm sure that for the people that are listening today, they've heard you, Fong, be a really great storyteller. And I think it's definitely a skill that perhaps that is just innate within you, right? But it's also something that you've practiced over time and you've honed in, right, through a lot of storytelling in big settings and small settings. I want to ask you about storytelling as a tool for advocacy, right? So, just a few moments ago, you were talking to us about how SLPs are advocating, right? And sometimes the outcome is not exactly what they were hopeful for, or it might be different than what they had envisioned. So, could you talk to us about how we can harness storytelling as a modality for advocating and maybe changing the perception and knowledge of others about speech pathology in public schools?
I do think that stories are everything. And I think it goes back to what we've already talked about, where if you feel safe enough to share your story, it's going to change something. From a leadership role, it's providing the safety to earn the trust to receive stories. And I think that's where, for me, for someone in a leadership role, when someone comes to you and they bravely share a need, that is a story. And stories to me are qualitative data that we need in order to make decisions to make the greatest impact for all of the communication journeys of our students and of their families and caregivers. And so it's recognizing that when they're saying a need, there's a story embedded there. And that story is the information you need, the converging data points. It's not just the compliance with the checklists and the numbers and the charts that your district has received from the state. That's half of it. The other half are the stories of your speech language pathologist. And when we take those in and we paint that comprehensive picture, that's when we get all of the information that we need. But in taking in those stories, that's also when you earn the trust of your people. It's also when they know, hey, this person has me. I'm good. I'm safe. And I'm going to keep sharing my stories, the data that you need, lead, to make those decisions in the same way. And I will not go down this path, but that's what we do with our students, right? We get their stories and their lived experiences, and that's the information we need for the assessments, not just the data from the formal assessments. And then in therapy, the same thing. We get their stories. How are they feeling, their emotions? And the thing about stories is that stories have data and facts, and stories also have feeling. And if you want to change people's minds, you will not just change it with numbers and bar graphs. You got to build it alongside a story. So anytime I do any type of advocacy, I always tell people, first, I want my intention. First, I want you to feel. If you're not feeling, my advocacy is not going to work. Then I want you to think. That's where the quantitative data comes in. That's where some of those numbers come in. And then last, I want to give you points for agency. Here are some things that I've already done to fuel the work. And then here are some things that we can work on together. Leadership, special education director, superintendent, whoever it is, for us to drive the center of our work, which ultimately are the students. And speaking of that, I will say it's important for SLPs to realize that when they have a need and they're advocating, do not gaslight yourselves by saying that you're whining or that you're not being a team player. You are advocating for those needs because that's what the students need, because all of our advocacy ultimately goes back to our students. They're the heartbeat, right? They're the center. And then what do our students need? Well, their biggest resource is us, the lovely speech language pathologists. So when you're advocating, do it boldly. You're doing it for your students, which also means you got to fuel yourself first. And then you're going to give from your overflow. That's a Rumi quote. That's not a Phuong quote, but I love it.
You know, I love what you said, Phuong, about first you've got to feel, then get the data, then take your agency and move forward. In my observation of different districts, I think the districts that will not tolerate the feeling part of the message are the ones that feel harsh in terms of a toxic work environment. The districts that will receive the feeling message and then do something and then feel on behalf of the students are the ones who are not as affected by vacancies, who have success with compensation issues, who focus on quality of service rather than on compliance. So that's a very powerful triangle, that field data agency is really, really compelling.
Yeah, it's like a trifecta of how we need to
Yeah.
move forward. But, I will say, Judy, you bring up a good point, because for those who are in districts who, for whatever reason, don't feel safe yet, the power of yet, to feel these needs, I also recognize how hard that can be. And I think for me, I've worked in spaces like that, and I get to see it, is that for those individuals, I think it's just recognizing where that district is. And so the change may not happen at the rate that you want it, but for you, right? Let's say for you as Phuong in that district, if I can recognize, oh, this organization is operating at the level where they're not open to change yet, at least you can recognize it's not a you issue. It's something they need to work on. But Phuong is still in control of her days. I'm not going to let the organization take over my days and feed into that anxiety and that overwhelm and that burden. I go back to me, and that's what I've learned a lot in the last 5 to 6 years. And then you can make the choices that you need to make to sustain yourself. But just by recognizing, like, I see where you're at, organization, but I'm going to do the best that I can within my corner of my world.
I love it. I think that my chiropractor is going to be really happy with this episode. Not that he's going to listen, but he's going to be happy because I'm going to need to go see him because I've been nodding so heavily for the last 50 minutes that he's going to have to adjust my neck. So this has been fantastic for him and for me as well. So we always have wrap up questions at the end of each episode. So we have two lined up for you, Phuong. Are you ready?
I'm
Awesome.
ready.
So we know you're a big music person of the hip hop persuasion, perhaps. What are some songs that are on replay for you right now in your earbuds?
I will say that in the last few weeks, this music is huge for me. But in the last few weeks, there is a song called Run by Loyiso, Lloyiso. And there in the chorus, he is a South African artist. And he says, I want to run into the sun. I know I'm not the only one. I'm going to fly, going to reach the sky, take up all the space and time. And I think that fourth line has just fueled me because in the last, I don't know how many years, but in this season of work, I'm going to be me, and I'm going to be me and take up all of the space and time that I need to do the work that is so meaningful to me. So I have recentered the joy of being a speech language pathologist. I have recentered the small stories that I earn from my students within those quiet moments, not the data moments, not the big moments, not even the IEP meetings, but those quiet moments when they're like, hey, Ko Phuong, I want to share with you that my slug passed away. And this is the dress that has slugs all over it because mama bought it for me so I can remember my slug. And so, take up that space, take up that time for you first, and then the rest will just fall into place.
I love it. I'm going to add that to my Spotify right after we get offline. So thank you for sharing that. That's
You're
awesome.
welcome.
Okay. And then the last question that we ask everybody who comes into this virtual recording booth is for you. What is leadership in one word?
To me, leadership in one word is truth. And I have to supplement that by saying that everyone gets to live their most authentic truth and that all of those truths are different. So it's not having the same experience, but it's providing that space where we get to earn those truths so then we can then work together collectively for the greater whole.
I love it. Judy, do you want to do our sign off?
No, because I'm still thinking about truth.
Oh,
You
I'm
can do it.
sorry. My bad.
No, that's
Take
okay.
your time.
I was like so drawn into what Phuong was saying that my mind is nowhere.
You know when it's good, when your mind is just
I'm
nowhere.
taking up all the space. I'm taking up all the space right now.
So much space, Judy.
So you can tell us goodbye, Natalie.
You're assuming that I'm not taking up a lot of
I
space
know
right
I
now,
am.
Judy.
We
Okay,
don't
give
usually
me
have
one.
trouble saying goodbye, Phuong. We don't. We usually are like, peace out, but I don't know.
No.
Today was special. It
I
was
think we
special.
get to, because we're feeling, and then we'll think
Yeah.
later, right?
Yeah.
And then, I mean, I know all three of us are doing action within our, small corners of the world. And I think of all of us like a chess piece, like a chess set. And we each are doing our work in our corners. But collectively, I have so much love and faith for this field. And I'll end with this. How about this? I'll get to say the goodbye. I spent time with SLPs to be this past Tuesday at a university. And at the very end of the session, they stuck around and they wanted to ask questions. And there was one student who slowly and thoughtfully said, I have a question for you, but I don't know how to ask it, but I'll try my best. And my question is, I already know the field may be hard, but how do you have so much hope for the field? And I responded to them and I said that our work is always bending toward justice, and it is. And it's not public. It's not on social media. It's not necessarily in presentations, but it's all of these quiet moments that you need to give yourselves credit for. And right now, everything kind of feels like it's in flux, but that's exactly what happens when truths have been unveiled and we know what we need to work on. And I will tell you, the work that I see at universities and in districts on campuses is beautiful. And I get hope from the new group of SLP. So it was them. It was the people that I got to connect with and spend time with, because they're advocating for things that I didn't even have vocabulary for. So it's connecting from the different generations of our work. It's connecting with our needs, our truths. But I have so much hope for this field. And I love the sun. I chase the sun all the time, seeing it rise, seeing it set. But like, I see our field as like this bright light that we get to like garner and gather right now. So I think we're in such a good place. And I think it's going to be so bright. I think this because I know it and I believe it.
My brain is still buzzing and my heart is still beating so happily after listening to Phuong's incredible perspective and amazing insights about how we as SLP leaders can really play a huge part in reducing that overwhelm for our SLP teams, but also the equally as important factor of taking care of ourselves first as leaders and giving ourselves permission to show up as whole people to our work. I know in this time of the semester, the idea of hope might be a slightly funny one or one that's kind of dim. So we would love for you to share this episode with someone who you think is in need of this kind of uplifting message. Please like and subscribe to our podcast wherever you've listened in today. And until next time, take care.